We love to quote these verses every year at Christmas time. It's Isaiah chapter 9, verses 6 and 7, and it sounds like this. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it, with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now, what many people don't realize whenever we quote this, only the first 7 words actually pertain to Christmas. For to us a child is born, and after that there was a 33-year gap, and then the next 6 words applied. To us a son is given. And then after those words, there has been another gap, and that gap has been 2,000 years and counting. The rest of these words in these verses have actually not come into effect yet. The government has not been placed upon his shoulders yet. But when it is, what is it going to be like? You are going to find out today on the Cross References podcast. Welcome to the Book of Ezekiel, a cross-references Bible study, where we learn how every small piece of the Bible tells one big story and how they all connect to the cross and Christ. My name is Luke Taylor, and I'm going to be doing a little bit more of connecting to the cross and Christ today than being in the Book of Ezekiel specifically. Next week, the plan is to get back into Ezekiel, but right now we're in a section of Ezekiel where we are looking at the millennial kingdom of Jesus, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, that is going to be coming to earth someday, perhaps, I hope, very, very soon. And so since that's the subject matter of the last 9 chapters of the book of Ezekiel, we've been taking a few weeks here just to talk about the millennial time period in general, and that's what we're going to be doing once again today. So today I want to share with you about how society and government are going to work in the 1,000-year reign of Christ. It's not just Isaiah 9:6 that we think is only about Christmas time, but it's really more so about this 1,000-year reign of Christ time period. There's a lot of verses in the Bible that way. And in fact, there's a very popular Christmas time song that's called Joy to the World. I'm sure you're familiar with it. That song actually does not pertain to the first coming of Christ. It's more of a song about the second coming, where it says he rules the world with truth and grace and makes the nations prove the glories of his righteousness and wonders of his love. Those words right there were not really about the first coming of Christ. You know, he didn't exactly take control of the world at that time and start ruling the world, but he is going to do that someday. That's really what that song is pointing to. Another place in the Bible that I think many Christians don't realize is really future is Psalm chapter 2, the second Psalm. This is a psalm that I would say this is specifically about the rebellion that takes place at the end of the millennium. So if you remember from one of our very first lessons in kind of getting an overview of the millennium, we talked about how at the end of the millennium, there is this rebellion, what I called the pointless rebellion, that's going to take place where the people, Satan is released from his prison, and the people of the world are given one final decision, one final chance, where they could choose the devil instead of choosing to follow Jesus. And some people, I don't know how many, I don't know what percentage of the population of the world it's going to be. I don't think it would be most people in the world, but I don't know. I think it's just going to be a small number compared to everyone who exists at that time, but there is going to be a rebellion against King Jesus at the end of the millennium that Satan stirs some of the people up and gets them to actually try to overthrow Christ himself. And again, it's pretty much pointless because Jesus is a little bit powerful, in case you didn't realize that, especially the glorified Christ who now exists after the resurrection. So these people are not going to stand a chance. And some of these people are going to rebel against Jesus at the end of the millennium and be cast into the lake of fire with Satan for all of eternity after that. And so Psalm 2 is a psalm that I actually believe is talking specifically about that rebellion at the end of the millennium. Now, it's kind of the way a lot of biblical language works, in this psalm especially, it kind of applies to a lot of things. Not necessarily stuff just in the millennium. There's a lot of things from Psalm chapter 2 that we can take and apply to today and pretty much any time in history. But I just think it has the most direct fulfillment at the end of the millennium with that final rebellion. So Psalm 2, and I've got the verses I can throw up here on the screen. If you're listening in podcast format, then I'll just let you know I've been doing these final episodes on Ezekiel. I've been kind of experimenting with a YouTube Bible study. So on Sunday nights, I put these out in video form. I'm doing a live video on YouTube. Okay, so like what I'm doing right now is not pre-recorded. If I need to stop and take a drink or something like that, I got my water bottle here, and it's just kind of like life just happens sometimes. If my dog gets up and starts running around and I have to put him up, this is actually, he's outside, but he's wanting to come inside. So I'm just saying we're doing life right now together. And so I'm doing a live Bible study on Sunday evenings, 6 p.m. And then if you are a podcast listener, you will receive this episode on Monday morning, which is the normal time that the Cross References podcast episodes would come out. So whether you want to watch it, whether you want to listen, either way is fine with me. I'm just glad you're here. And let's take a look at Psalm chapter 2 and the first 6 verses right here. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves against the rulers and take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Now, again, I think this is about the millennium, because the only time that this has been true, it has not been true. The only time it will be true is whenever Jesus is set as king of the world at the second coming of Christ. That's the only time that he will literally be God's king who has been set on Zion, his holy hill. So I believe it's talking about this, and it's talking about this rebellion that, as I said, it's totally ridiculous that anyone's going to try to rebel against Jesus at the end of the millennium. It says Satan is loosed for a short season. He deceives the nations. He rallies them together against God, this one last attempt. And you probably asked this question before. Why? Why would people do something like this? It just seems so dumb. And if that's the question you have today, let me tell you, you are asking the right question, because that's the exact question that God is asking right here. Why would you try to defeat God in physical warfare? It's so stupid. So if you're asking that question, you're asking the right question. That's why it says, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? It's pointless. It's in vain. Okay. It's not going to get you anywhere. It's a pointless rebellion. And God literally laughs at them. It says, you had 1,000 years under the greatest ruler that this world has ever known, the most perfect ruler who has ever existed, who ever could exist, the perfect being. If that's not good enough for you, I have no pity for you. I will laugh at your stupidity. That's basically what God is saying right here. There's just no excuse for this rebellion. There's no chance of it succeeding. And then now in the next 3 verses, I want you to pay special attention, because this is Jesus right here talking. I believe Psalm 2 is also a conversation amongst members of the Trinity. And I'm not going to take time. I haven't personally taken time to study it out and try to figure out, when is God speaking? When is the Holy Spirit speaking? When is Jesus speaking? I have not totally settled all those questions, except for right here. I can tell you this is Jesus talking right here. Starting at verse 7, he says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So this phrase right here, this refers to how Jesus is going to rule at the time that he's in charge of the world. It says he will rule with a rod of iron. That means Jesus will be pretty strict. Okay, rod of iron signifies the death penalty. Whenever people sin, they are going to be dealt with pretty significantly and pretty swiftly. Okay, in the millennium, this is distinct from the new heavens and the new earth. The millennium, the 1,000 years, is in Revelation 20. The new heavens and new earth come along in Revelation 21 and 22. Those are going to be perfect. That's where things are going to be totally sinless for all eternity and perfect. But in Revelation 20, sin is still possible. In the millennium, basically, sin is still going to be possible. It will still happen. Okay, not everything has been made new. It's not all been perfected at this time. This is Jesus just kind of showing us, even in a sin-struck world, how it can be done. And so that's what he's going to be doing. So sin will still be possible, but unlike any other time in history, it's going to be dealt with perfectly and pretty swiftly. And law-breaking is going to happen, but it's not going to be tolerated. So hear these words, citizens of earth, verses 10 through 12. Now, therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. Now, you might say, wait a minute, what's this talking about? It's talking about kings and rulers. How can there be kings and rulers if Jesus is king of the world? Well, the answer is there will still be nations on earth during the millennium. There's still going to be independent sovereign nations, but they are all in submission to Israel and in submission to Israel's king, which is Jesus. So not every nation is going to go into the millennium. I think this is actually what the judgment of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, it's actually talking about that, which nations are going to go into the millennium. So I live in America. America might go into the millennium. America might not go into the millennium. I don't know. But let's say that we're here. Let's say that we get there, okay? America could still have a president. It doesn't mean that he can overrule what Jesus says to do, but America is still going to have a leader. And so the leader is going to be the president. They can still vote and choose who they would like to have be their leader. And, it's kind of interesting because American presidents are often considered the most powerful man in the world. I was going to say or woman, but we haven't had a woman president. So American presidents are usually called, you're the most powerful man in the world once you become elected to the Oval Office of the United States. Because the United States is kind of the dominant empire on the world scene, has been for some time. And so to become the leader of the U.S. can often be equated with being the leader of the free world or the leader of the world, period. Just as being the most powerful person on planet Earth. However, that's not going to be the case in the millennium. Okay, the president of the United States, there might still be one, but he's not going to be the most powerful man in the world. That is going to be Jesus. And so it's saying the American president someday, he better kiss the Son, lest he be angry, because Jesus is not tolerating rebels in his world order. He's going to rule with a rod of iron. So Jesus is going to keep things tamped down. He's going to keep a tight leash on mankind and make sure sin does not have an opportunity to run amok. But remember, Jesus is also the Prince of Peace. There might still be a lot of nations in the world, but they're not going to be fighting with each other, kind of the way that you see nations going after each other today. That kind of thing is not going to be going on during the millennial time period. In fact, there's not even going to be armies and militaries. There's not going to be a purpose or a need for the militaries like what we have right now. Isaiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. And I couldn't fit them all on the screen at once, so I'll add the rest of them here in a second. But it says, the word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up over the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many peoples shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then verse 4 is key. And I'm sorry I didn't throw it up on the screen yet. Apologize if you're watching. Here's verse 4, and this is really the key verse I want you to get here today. He shall judge between the nations, and shall decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. You know, it's kind of interesting about that verse, specifically verse 4 right there, about they're going to beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. And if you have, if you're familiar with that phrase, with that expression, you've probably heard those verses quoted before. They're very famously posted outside of the United Nations in Europe. Or maybe it's their UN office in New York. I can't remember off the top of my head, but very famously, they have placed that verse on a memorial or something like that outside of the United Nations, saying that, you know, through this globalistic agenda of the UN, that they could achieve world peace, that they will fulfill these verses right here, that people will someday no longer lift up sword against each other, that there will be world peace, and that there will be no more wars going on between the nations. You know, that's kind of the vision of the UN. It's not a bad goal to have, but I hate to break it to you, UN, but that's actually not going to come to fulfillment until Jesus sets foot on this earth. If there's someone else who shows up in the meantime, and there will be, who's going to promise peace, who's going to, everyone's going to be saying peace and safety, someone who's going to come in and perhaps create some kind of deal, some kind of covenant among many peoples to where there's going to be peace and security throughout the world and everything looks just fine and dandy. I have a problem with that. That's not going to be Jesus. That's going to be the Antichrist who shows up and does that and deceives a lot of people. That's why he's called the Antichrist. He's going to deceive people into thinking that maybe this is the second coming of Christ. That's not how it's going to work, okay? When Jesus comes back, he's going to put an end to the Antichrist's rule. The Antichrist is not even, it's a false peace what he's going to bring. The Antichrist, as soon as he gets into power, that's the first seal judgment in Revelation 6. The second seal judgment in Revelation 6 is that war breaks out across the world. So that peace is going to be very, very short-lived, the peace that the Antichrist promises, okay? It's a false peace. It won't last but a minute. It's going to go on for 7 years. Then Jesus is going to come back to this earth. There's not going to be confusion about the second coming of Christ. We're not going to be thinking, I wonder if it's that guy. It's not going to work that way, guys. He's going to set foot on the Mount of Olives. It's going to split in two. A mountain's going to split in two. And then Jesus is going to take control of the world. There's not going to be confusion about whether the second coming of Christ is here, okay? Everyone's going to know. So when the Antichrist shows up and people are like, could this be Jesus? When the real Jesus comes back, there's not even going to be a question about it. So how did I get into that? Okay, we were talking about the UN. So listen, I'm not saying it's a bad agenda to want to have world peace. Yeah, we all want world peace, right? But it's not actually going to happen, okay? It's a false promise of the UN that they could get us to Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, because that's a verse about when Jesus is here, okay? Let me look at another verse with you here today. Isaiah 19, verses 23 through 25. This is the peace of Jesus when he's king. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. In that day Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. So it's saying in the millennium, guys, these nations that are all fighting and they're kind of at each other's throats right now, they're all going to get along and be friends. There's not going to be any more of this conflict like what we have right now. It seems unbelievable to imagine that. But there's an old joke about Bill Clinton rubbing a bottle and a genie pops out, and I remember he asked for peace in the Middle East, and I won't go into what the whole joke says, but he's wishing for all these different things, and anyway, I just always remember that from as a kid. People have always wanted to try to find some way to get peace in the Middle East, and that's been a pipe dream for the past 2,000 years and counting. Actually, you go back further than that, there has always been massive conflict. Really, it's a spiritual battle that has been in that Middle East region of the world, especially centered right there where Israel is. And so that's been going on for thousands of years. And sad to say, it is going to continue till Jesus comes back. Okay, so that's just a reality of the world that we live in. There's not even a genie in a bottle who could make world peace or peace in the Middle East. All right, but in the millennium, guys, someday those nations are going to get along like brothers. All right, these nations who battle with each other. There's going to be no more October 7th of, what was that, 2023, when all those poor Israeli people were just slaughtered in that terrible attack. I think it was the most Israeli people who had been killed ever since the Holocaust. There's going to be no more of that going on. They're actually all going to get along. They're all going to be friends. Isn't that just wild? But that's what the Bible says. And not just those nations, the world. No more Russia, Ukraine fighting over who's got what territory, okay? It's all going to be resolved. There's not going to be militaries fighting with each other, all right? And Jesus is going to tell people where their borders are, and you deal with it. If you don't like it, it's too bad. Jesus is king. Isaiah 32, 17 and 18. And the effect of righteousness will be peace. And the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. My people will abide in a peaceful habitation, in secure dwellings, and in quiet resting places. And then Micah chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. And he's kind of semi-quoting Isaiah right here. Or maybe Isaiah was quoting Micah. I didn't look up who came first, actually. But anyway, it's kind of parallel to Isaiah 2. Micah chapter 4, verses, I'm not going to do all of those verses, but 2 and 3. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide disputes for strong nations far away. And so in the millennium, nations, they are still going to have their sovereignty, okay? They're still going to have their own, they can make their own decisions for themselves in a lot of ways. They can they could probably set their own tax rates. They can probably impose their own criminal statutes. They can create their own budgets and things like that. There's a lot of variety. You think of it like in the United States of America and how we have all these various states, okay? And there's actually quite a bit of variety in how states can be run. Some states are just better to live in than others, right? Okay, some states just have really great laws or really great tax codes or benefits or something like that other states don't have. And so there can be a lot of variety in how states are run, but ultimately they are all subject to the guidelines or rules of the United States federal Constitution. Okay, we have a federal Constitution that governs all 50 states. And so while states can have some of their own sub-rules under that, their own personal constitutions for how they want to run things, those have to be in alignment with what the federal Constitution says in Washington, D.C., which applies to all 50 states. It's going to be something similar to that on a worldwide basis in the millennial kingdom of Jesus. They will get some freedom for their own individual jurisdictions of how these nations want to run themselves, but they ultimately are going to have some standards that are given by Jesus himself to tell people what they have to obey. It'll be like this, if say France is there, okay? It's going to be like Jesus will say, yeah, okay, France, you can have your own language, you can have your own laws, but you can't put up an idol of Zeus in Paris, okay? That's going to be crossing the line, right? Jesus is not going to tolerate putting up an idolatrous image in Paris if France wants to do that. But there's a lot of other things France could do that are not going to be in the realm of idolatry or something. They can probably set their own tax code and stuff like that. So, but remember, sin is still going to be possible in the kingdom, all right? It's not going to be possible by you and me. You and I, if you're saved right now, then you go into the millennial kingdom in a glorified state. We're not going to have a desire to sin ever again. But there's also going to be all these other people who were not saved before the rapture. They survive the tribulation, and then they go into the millennial kingdom, or people who are going to be born later because there's going to be there's going to be population boom, and people are going to have longer lifespans in the millennium. So we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. There's going to be lots and lots of people in the millennium who are not in a glorified state, and they can still sin. They can still do wrong. So there will still be sin possible, and sin is going to happen in the world, but it's not going to be able to just run amok. All right? It's not going to be like ancient Israel, where the people were building idols on the high places all the time. All right? If anyone tries that in the kingdom of Jesus, they're going to be dead. I would say probably anything that carried a death penalty in the Old Testament Mosaic law, it'll probably carry the death penalty in the kingdom of Jesus as well. All right? There's nothing wrong with the death penalty whenever it's applied properly, and I'd say biblically. And so these things will still get you the death penalty he's going to rule with a rod of iron. So these things are still going to happen. That's what it means to rule with a rod of iron. A couple verses here from Revelation 19:15. From his mouth comes a sharp sword, talking about Jesus, with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. And then Revelation 2 also gives this promise to the church, verses 26 and 27. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron, as when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received authority from my Father. And then there's also a passage in Zechariah 14, and we're going to be studying that chapter also in a few weeks. I have an upcoming, I'll tell you where we're going over the next few weeks in a few minutes. But we're going to be looking at Zechariah chapter 14. It's a chapter all about the millennium, and it has a passage that describes how if you do not obey Jesus whenever it comes to observing the feasts, because the feasts are going to be in effect during the millennial time period, if you don't observe the feasts, he's going to shut off rain in your country. Okay, Zechariah 14, verses 17 through 19. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt, and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. So just think about that for a minute. No king in history, no president in history has had power over the weather, right? That's never been a thing. Like if Trump is mad at Canada, Trump can slap some tariffs on Canada if he wants to. He can throw that at them, but he can't turn off their rain. He can't control their rain supply. That is something that Jesus is going to be able to do. All right? Jesus doesn't have to negotiate. If you're not going to do righteously, he can turn off your weather. Like that's a power that he has. We've never had a leader like that in the history of the world before. So if someone, he says, keep the feasts worldwide, not just the Jewish people. In the kingdom of Jesus, we're going to keep the feasts. We'll talk more about that next week in Ezekiel 45 and 46, which is where we'll be next time. But if you don't obey keeping the feasts in the millennium, he'll turn off your rain. He says, okay, if you get it back next year, if you come and keep the feast next year. So then I think everyone will be back the next year. And I'm sure someone will try it at least once, or else the warning wouldn't have been there. So I got about one more page of notes. I've gone through, just to give you a hint here of how fast I'm going through this, I've got 7.5 pages of notes, and I've gotten through 6.5. So I'm just about done. But let me tell you where we're going over the next few weeks. So next week, we are going to be in Ezekiel 45 and 46. I'm going to cover 2 chapters of Ezekiel in one lesson, which is a lot faster than I usually do. It's kind of interesting, though. All the commentaries I looked at, they really do treat 45 and 46 as like a whole big unit. So I'm going to get through both of those chapters next time, and we're going to talk about the subject, finally, of why are there sacrifices in the millennium? Because that's going to come up a lot in those chapters, and some of these other things like keeping the feasts and all that. I'll give you my reasons why I see the sacrifices being there, and why we're going to go back into some of these, what we might call the Old Testament laws of keeping the feasts. There's a lot of good questions about that. Why are there sacrifices if Jesus was the sacrifice? Why are there feasts if Jesus was the fulfillment of all these things in the Old Testament law? So these are really good questions, and we're going to get into all of that next time. And so I hope you will be subscribed. If you're subscribed on the podcast, make sure you're subscribed so you get it next week. And if you are a video live stream follower here, like right now, make sure you're subscribed on the YouTube channel, and you'll be able to get that. It's just going to be called Sacrifices in the Millennium, with a quotation mark, or with an exclamation point and a question mark, and that all that on there. So, because that's a big question. So that's next week. Then we'll be in Ezekiel for those 2 chapters. Then I'm gonna also step back into the millennium. I want to talk about health, wealth, life, prosperity in the millennium. I sound a little bit like a prosperity preacher when I start talking about prosperity. And that's actually the issue, okay? A lot of verses that prosperity preachers use to say God wants to make you rich, they pull verses from places like Isaiah that are actually about the millennium. And they pull those verses and try to say that it actually applies for today. And so anyway, I want to give some of those verses, visit some of those things in context, and talk about what those verses really mean. They don't mean what some of these, I don't know if I want to name names, but some of these prosperity preachers out there, they don't mean exactly what they tell you. So we'll talk about that next time, in 2 weeks. I'm going to share a message that's actually a look back at Ezekiel chapter 21. So it's going to be kind of a flashback. It's going to be a new recording from me, but I'm going to share that in a few weeks. And then we'll get back into this millennium topic. We're going to talk about the changing topography of the Middle East. When Jesus comes back and I said he sets feet on the Mount of Olives and that mountain splits, okay, there's going to be a lot of topographical changes to the region of Israel at that time. And so we will talk about that, because we're going to spend, I think that's the Ezekiel 14 lesson. We're going to talk about all the ways that God is going to change the landscape, at least of the region of Israel. I don't know how much of the rest of the world, but that Israel is going to get a big makeover at the end of the 7 years of tribulation. And it's going to be kind of a new, I think topography is the word. There's going to be a new lay of the land in the millennial time period. Then we're going to get back into the book of Ezekiel. We will talk about the river of chapter 47. And then we will talk about the land allotments of chapter 48. And then we'll be pretty much done. I'll do another lesson that kind of looks back on Ezekiel as a whole and just kind of recaps some of the things that we've learned as we have, what I'll say is crawled through this book over the past 3.5 years. Okay, we started this in 2021. So we're like 3.5 years into this thing. All right. And we will finish it up just here in the next few months. I'm really excited about it. And so that's where we're going. Let me make one more note here as we're winding down. I want to just talk about society for a few minutes. What's the more like, we kind of been looking at this bird's eye view of government in the millennium for a little bit here. Let's bring it down to the societal level. What's it like in the neighborhoods? What's it like in the everyday life? And I've talked about you and I's roles over the past few weeks, that we will be ruling and reigning with Christ. We'll be in that glorified state. So we're going to have more administrative roles in the kingdom of Jesus. But for the regular, the average Joe, the guy who's still in the sin-capable body, the guy who's not, or the girl who has not been placed in a body yet where they are in a glorified state, they're not sinless, and they can still get sick, and they can still die even, because some people are going to die in the millennium. But what's their lives going to be like? Let's talk about that for a little bit. Think about the period really here in the West of what we call the Industrial Revolution, and how much the world changed back in I think probably the first half of the 1900s. Isn't that what we call the Industrial Revolution? Just think about how much life changed over a period of 50 years. Okay, in 1900, there was no such thing as an airplane. People did not, maybe some people had concepts of flight in the future, but there was no airplanes flying around in the sky. This was not something familiar to people, okay? To think of how long it would take to travel from place to place. They didn't even really have many cars in 1900, right? I mean, all that even came along later. So think of how long travel would take. How long you get in your horse and buggy, horse carriage. and be pulled somewhere, and it'd take hours just to get somewhere that in modern times we could travel there in 10 minutes. But it would take them hours to get there back in those days, unless you just hopped on a horseback and rode as fast as you could. They didn't have concepts of things like planes in the average everyday life. In 1900, that's how it was. But then you go forward 50 years in time, all of a sudden you can buy a plane ticket and you can fly anywhere you want to in the world in a day's time, right? I mean, think of how long it would take in 1900 to travel all around the world. There was a book, right? Around the World in 80 Days. I never read it. Was it because that was like considered a feat? If you could get all the way around the world in 80 days time, that would have been like considered a really record-breaking trip to do it that fast. I think that's the concept of the book. Okay, 80 days. Whenever that book was written, I should have talked to ChatGPT about some of these details before I just started spouting off about it. But think about that. It'd take that long. Okay, 50 years later, you could hop on a plane. You could fly around the world within a couple days. I mean, is that not mind-blowing how much faster society advanced in just 50 years of time? Now, why am I saying all this? Why am I talking about all this? Okay, what once took weeks or months of travel could now be done in a day or two. All right, less than 20 years after that, we're building rocket ships to go to the moon. Isn't that amazing? Nowadays, in 2025, we have people dreaming about going to Mars. Think about communication. That was travel. Think of how communication was revolutionized over the first half of the 19th or the 20th century, okay? We went from telephones to cell phones. We did that in a period of about 100 years, right? Telephones are invented, and when it started off, it was just like they had one telephone per apartment building, right? And you know, like everyone might have had a receiver, but you couldn't even have a private conversation because everyone had receivers in their own rooms. Okay, and then everyone got their own personal telephone. And then eventually we got to a point where people have cell phones and you can carry this little rectangle around in your pocket, all right? 40 years ago, if you wanted to know anything about anything, you needed to get like a $2,000 encyclopedia set, right? You had maybe, if you were rich enough, you had a shelf in your house somewhere with an encyclopedia set that had all the information in the world, as much as they could fit into an encyclopedia. And that's where you'd go if you wanted to find a bunch of data, or you'd go down to the library and use your Dewey Decimal System and try to look information up in a book, which you could still do that stuff. But guess what? Now I can pull this little rectangle out. Oh, I got some text messages here I haven't kept up with. You can pull this little rectangle out and you can find out anything you want to know about just basically anything. You can find out where Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce stayed last night. I don't even want to know that information, but you know what? There's so much information on these little rectangles, it just gets thrown in my face every time I turn it on. All right, so think about how information flows so freely today compared to 100 years ago. Think of all the ways that it's advanced. Now, why am I saying all this? Why all this buildup? What's this preamble all about? The millennial kingdom of Christ is going to be a time period that's even more productive than the last 100 years have been. Okay, the first 100 years of the millennial kingdom is going to advance society way more than even what we've done in the past 100 years. Okay, because guess what? A world run by Jesus, a world run by righteousness, a world where we aren't going to have conflicts and wars really holding us back and slowing us down from advancing in a lot of ways. Okay, a world without all of that holding us back, we are going to be capable of even more in the first 100 years of Jesus' kingdom than what we've done for the past 100 years. And then think about this. It's going to continue 10 times as long as that. 10 times as much as 100 years. Okay? 100 years, 200 years, 300 years. And guess what? A world run by Jesus is going to be more productive than a world run by man, which is what we've had for the past 100 years, and for every period of 100 years before that. The kingdom of Jesus is going to be even more productive. So guess what? I mean, I know we can get a little silly daydreaming about stuff like this. If I said, hey, maybe someday you can go to Disney World on the moon. Now that would sound kind of silly and like I'm letting my imagination run away with me. And I am being a little silly. I don't think there's going to be a Disney World on the moon, okay? But I do think anything that we were capable of in a world that's tainted by all this sin and given over to the devil, I think anything we were capable of doing now, at least that much is going to be possible in the world run by Jesus, okay? Jesus is God in the flesh. A world run by him is going to be capable of greater things than a world that's been run by the devil, which is what it has been for all this time. So, I even apply that to things like space travel. All right? If man could figure out how to get to the moon in a world that was run by sinful people, don't you think they could figure out how to do it again in the millennium? Don't you think we could probably build a whole colony up there? Don't you think we could probably go to more planets? All right? Think of all the places in the world right now that we've never even explored. The deepest parts of the oceans, which are so dangerous and, trepidatious to even go places like that. Well, guess what? Someday, I believe in the millennium, in the kingdom run by Jesus, we're going to be capable of exploring even more than what we can do now. Because society is going to be so much more advanced, so much more innovative. The world's really all going to be working together. And we're going to be able to do things in the world in the future that even far exceed what we've been able to do today. So again, I could let my imagination run away with me and come up with some silly ideas, and then you'd turn this off and you'd say, you're just making stuff up, which I would be. I don't know what's going to be possible in the millennial period, which is ruled by Jesus. But I just want to make this point. Any good thing we've been able to do up until now, that's going to at least be possible in the millennium, okay, in a world that's run by Jesus. So I imagine there will be mind-blowing things that mankind is able to accomplish in that 1,000-year period, even in the first probably 10 or 20 years, so far beyond what we've been able to do now. So it's going to be exciting times. We'll be able to go to the highest mountains, to the farthest planets we can find, to the lowest parts of the ocean, to, who knows, maybe we can go hundreds of miles underground. Maybe we'll figure out a way. Maybe we'll finally find Carmen Sandiego. That's a deep callback. If you don't know who Carmen Sandiego, let me know in the comments if you even got that reference right there. But guys, we're just about wrapped up with Ezekiel. So next week, we'll get back into the book of Ezekiel, chapters 45 and 46. I know I haven't been in the book of Ezekiel for about a month now. I've been studying these chapters in the background. But hey, make sure you're subscribed so you can get that episode. And I'll go ahead and sign off for today. Thanks for listening to this Cross References Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. This has been Luke Taylor, and I hope the Bible makes more sense to you after this episode.